So one of the questions that we've had from the box is about an article that was in the Telegraph recently about herpes infection and the links with it causing dementia. And the question is this possible? And as with many things that, as I mentioned in my talk, that we see in the news, often what we see in the papers isn't the full story. So there are some researchers that have been very interested in particular infections and the role that they might be playing. And I think the take-home message from some of these studies is that they look at particular infections, they look at samples of tissue, of brain tissue from people who've died from some of these different diseases that cause dementia, and try to draw links. And what they've been able to see is that sometimes you can see evidence of these viruses or these bacteria within the brain. However, we don't know enough as to why those are there. Were they causal? Is it a consequence of the disease? So has something meant that these viruses and bacteria can now get into the brain? And that's why they're found there, not that they're actually driving any disease or causing it. So I think Emma knows much more about the immune system and inflammation, but certainly this is something we're trying to understand. And I think our current idea around this is that there isn't one particular infection, so not one virus or one bacterial infection that causes any type of dementia. It's probably more to do with the way our bodies are responding to it and that kind of historic inflammation that we've had in our lives that could be driving some of the changes that we're seeing in the brain. So that was one of the questions. Should I do my second one?
Yes.
Yep. So there was another one here, and it says, what is your consideration for BME, so that is black and ethnic minority groups, who apparently are at a higher risk of dementia? And they reference a study that was from 2016. So this is another really interesting area whereby it appears that certain ethnic groups seem to have a different level of risk to other groups. And it's a real challenging area for us to understand. So there is some evidence that there are higher rates of dementia within some of these black and Asian ethnic minority groups. But we don't know enough yet. The other challenge we have with these groups is that there's a lot more stigma in some of these communities. So certainly some of the work that we're doing at Alzheimer's Research UK is trying to break down that stigma, so providing information in people's native languages. And actually one of the challenges even in doing that is that some of these languages don't have a word for dementia or some of the diseases that cause it. So trying to provide information, trying to open up those conversations. So we're doing a lot of focus groups and work to understand the challenges within those communities and understand how we can then provide materials, provide support, ensure that these people are seeking a diagnosis as well. So one of the bits I do know is that people from these communities often go to a doctor much later than other people do. And that means that they're not able to access treatment in the same way, they can't plan their future as well in the same way. So there's a lot of consideration going on around these different communities and how we can improve the situation.
Okay, so I've been given a couple of really interesting questions here. So the first one that I'm going to answer is, do anti-inflammatory drugs prevent the onset of dementia? And this is really quite interesting at the moment. There have been quite a lot of studies done in other universities that have shown that anti-inflammatory drugs that are given to patients with other conditions like arthritis have quite a positive effect in reducing the risk of developing dementia. So it is possible in some ways that some anti-inflammatory drugs are able to slow down the progression. And I think we're sort of beginning now to understand how that mechanism works, what the structure of the chemicals are, so that we can see whether they can enter the brain more easily and possibly even think about trying to repurpose those drugs for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And the next question that I have is, what thoughts are there regarding the focus on the link between autoimmune conditions and the development of Alzheimer's? And this is quite a difficult question to answer, actually, because there are a lot of different cells in your body that are responsible for different types of inflammation and immunity. And so the cells that drive autoimmune disease are slightly different to those that are responsible for causing the inflammation in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. But we understand now that there is some crossover between the cells in the body that can be causing or contributing to autoimmune disease in the brain, and they can actually cross that barrier, that protective barrier that fences off the brain from the rest of the body, and enter the brain to cause more problems. So there is an interesting link between autoimmunity and Alzheimer's disease as well that we really are needing to have a bit more understanding of. So I hope that answers the questions.
Okay, so the first question is,
what causes damage to the DNA in the first place? It's a very interesting question. Actually, we accumulate mutations every day in our cells. Because the cells, they replicate, and so they have to copy the genome, the library, in a new cell. And of course, this process of copying is producing some mistakes here and there. And there are factors, for example, in the environment that are increasing this rate of mistakes. For example, smoke or some pollutants. However, some of these mutations, they are not harmful because they happen in parts of the genome that are not really important. And these mutations are called somatic mutations. They are very important for cancer. These mutations are at the base of cancer, but it's unlikely that these mutations that we accumulate every day are giving us dementia. There is another type of mutation that is probably more damaging, and is the type of mutation that happens in the gametes, so in the sperm or in the egg. And these mutations are really bad because they are fixed and they are passed through generations. So the mutations that we accumulate every day, they are in adult cells. We don't pass them to our kids, while the mutations that we have in our gametes, those mutations we can pass to our progeny. And our kids will pass these mutations to their kids and so on. So all the mutations that we know now for dementia, for example, or for Parkinson, these are mutations that have been generated probably 100 of years ago, and even more they are ancient mutations, basically, that happened in the gamete of one of our ancestors, and they have been fixed in the population and passed down through generations. The second question that I have is, my father has dementia. Do I have an increased chance of getting it? Is it genetic? Okay, the answer is that it's impossible to say if we don't analyze the genome of your dad and your genome, and we compare them. And you remember the iceberg that I showed you? The tip of the iceberg is actually they are the familial cases for dementia. So the small minority of cases are familial. The small minority is actually inherited from generation to generation. The vast majority of people with dementia are actually sporadic, so they don't have a positive familial history. Let's maybe suppose that your dad, unfortunately, is a familial case, so there is a mutation in a gene, and first of all, we need to check your DNA to see whether you have inherited that mutation or not, because there is a chance that you don't have inherited that mutation. Let's look at the worst scenario. So your dad has a mutation, you have inherited that mutation. Still, we cannot tell you that you are going to have dementia 100%, because these mutations, as I show you, there is not one single cause of dementia. It's a cocktail of factors. So even if you have the mutation, maybe that mutation will be counteracted by something else in your genome so that you will not going to get dementia, or the environment in which you live is a healthy environment, so there will be no environmental risk factor contributing to the dementia. So actually, it's basically impossible to say whether you will get dementia.
Yeah,
Can you have Lewy body's dementia if you haven't got Parkinson's?
So I think the question is, can you have Lewy body dementia without Parkinson's? And I guess our resident expert, Claudia, will be able to pick up on that.
Parkinson and Lewy body's dementia are two different disorders, but they share one clinical feature, which is called Parkinsonism. So, for example, tremors or a stiff posture, impairment in walking, slow movements. This kind of movement component is called Parkinsonism. is present in pure Parkinson, is also present in a range of different disorders which are not Parkinson but have a Parkinsonian component. For example, dementia with Lewy bodies. So in dementia with Lewy bodies, you have first dementia, and then you have the starting of the motor symptoms. While in a dementia person, like for example in Alzheimer case, you don't have the motor component. So it is very, very difficult to clinically diagnose these disorders because they also differ from patient to patient in terms of when they start. So there are people that start with a movement impairment and they get dementia in a certain amount of months. There are other people, we start with the dementia component and then they get the movement disorder after. So it's very difficult to diagnose. So this is why you need to go to a very well-trained neurologist to get the diagnosis.
I just wanted to ask if there was any research going on to do with autophagy and fasting, and if there was, are you looking for any volunteers?
So autophagy is a really hot area of research, and this is essentially a cellular process whereby our cells can recycle their components and reuse them. And there's been some studies that indicate that certain diets, so like a fasting diet, might be able to enhance this response within our cells to improve the way that they're recycling their components. I'm not aware of any going on to do with dementia and fasting to see whether that will switch on autophagy, but certainly we've got a lot of researchers based at Cambridge University that are trying to trigger autophagy using drugs and molecules like that so that we could maybe create a treatment that would trigger that process, improve the way that our cells are recycling and using their resources to then clear away a lot of the waste products that we've mentioned quite a lot today so that they're better able to handle the jobs that they're needed to do. So I'm not aware of any in particular, but it is an area that we're studying.
There's a question about the pharmacy. The number of pills distributed to people, especially when they get older. They get bags and bags of those things. Personally, I use my little phone with the alarm function, and at the times that I have to take those blooming pills, I set the alarm at that moment and tell what I have to take. And that could be developed in something like an app or whatever, so that this thing is slightly controlled.
I don't know if Rosemary wants to. Do you want to pick up on that? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly alarms are widely used by people to help them remember, to remind them to take their medicines. And there are various sort of applications to help people as well. But I'm unaware of specific ones that we can then, as a pharmacist or a healthcare professional, recommend it because we haven't quite tested the effectiveness of it. But certainly in terms of apps, those kind of mechanisms would be helpful to help people, to remind people to take medicines at a specific time. Yeah. So thank you for that suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add, I think it's certainly an area of interest for researchers. I don't know if Katy mentions about the charity, is using digital technology, so wearable technology, to improve the sort of compliance with medication, particularly in people living with dementia.
We can't all row across the Indian Ocean, but quite a few of us here might be interested to know if you've got any evidence of the degree of activity that would help. I ask as somebody who was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome 2 months ago and told that I'd be in hospital probably for the rest of this year. I didn't like that, so I decided to break the rules and exercise as much as I could, and I walked out of the hospital on the 3rd of January. Apparently this is a bit unusual, so I'm curious to know what else I need to do to stay alive and be able to water ski when I'm 100.
We have a workshop about physical activity and the guidelines for physical activity. I can give you the guidelines, but they will vary with age, and they will vary with disease progression as well. So the World Health Organization says that to see benefits of physical activity, we need to engage in 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise. And that's exercise that you can do that increases your heart rate, but you're still able to maintain a conversation while doing it. So things like brisk walking or cycling on flat surfaces. And these guidelines are the same for whether you're 18 years old or 80 years old, but they will vary with different disease statuses. So the other thing that is really important, especially for people who are older, is doing at least 2 days a week of exercises that improve mobility and flexibility, like yoga or Pilates, and 2 days a week of muscle strengthening exercises, like it doesn't necessarily have to be lifting weights, but things like carrying groceries or gardening as well. So those are the WHO guidelines, and I might pass over if you want to add on to that a bit more.
Yes, there do have some research shows that the exercise, physical activities after you have been diagnosed after Parkinson's will still help. So if I'm right, so it's recommended to do 2.5 hours of moderate exercise per week. So equally like 30 minutes of moderate exercise 5 times per week. Hope this can help, but always suggest like before it goes to the diagnosis or before that, always keep the habit of physical activities is always good help for us health. Thank you.
Yes, with reference to the headlines in the newspapers, it's a pharmacological question. Does hay fever medication really affect anything? Because the hay fever season is well with us, with the tree pollen starting now.
So I know some of the studies that you're talking about. There have been some studies looking at the links between taking hay fever medicines and whether that increases your risk of dementia. And I think there is some small increased risk, but also, as with anything, if those hay fever medications are helping you to live a better quality of life, with everything you have to take that kind of risk and benefit ratio into consideration. So there are risks with everything that we do, but if the benefits outweigh those risks, then that's why we still do them. So it's probably not the only causal factor of people developing dementia, but it's certainly something that there is a small amount of evidence that it has a slight increase in people's risk.
Very helpful and hopeful listening into, knowing that this wide range of research is taking place in our laboratories. What I want to find out is if the researchers here are collaborating internationally with other agencies.
Yeah, well, I'll kick off and then I can pass round. So where we are a local network in terms of joining up the universities of Reading with Oxford and Oxford Brookes, we also have collaborative links in America and far and wide, and that's linking up and giving us the best chance for a scientist and from a neuroscientist and from a dementia scientist perspective. I think collaboration is the key. I don't think it's going to be one laboratory that's going to solve the complex issue that you've heard about today. I think it's going to be much more of a collaborative effort to take this forward, so to speak. I don't know if people want, there might be various collaborations that people want to talk about.
I want to give you an example. For example, for genetics, we definitely need to collaborate. So I'm part of the administrative committee of the IFGC, which stands for International Frontotemporal Dementia Genomics Consortium. It's a group made of 45 working groups distributed between the States, Canada, UK, Europe, Australia. And we meet every year once. We have newsletters, so we keep contact with each other, and we really work together. So we have clinicians in different places collecting samples, enrolling patients, and following the patients through their life, and then they send us the DNA so that we can sequence the DNA, we can analyze it. But again, for analyzing the data, since we have so many data, we need other people from other groups groups that have other techniques for analysis, so we can actually multiply our possibility of getting results and finding new things. So definitely we need to be open to collaborations.
I definitely second that. So the Whitehall study that I described today, that's part of a large European collaboration called LifeBrain, and that's a project that's funded by the EU Horizon 2020 grant, where we are pooling together neuroimaging scans that have been collected from 7 different European countries, combining 11 different neuroimaging cohorts. So we now can ask the same questions, but they are much bigger and broader, and we can do them more in depth. And so this is kind of involving centers in Oxford, Cambridge, Norway, Netherlands, Spain, Denmark, Germany, and a couple more, which I forget. But there is a lot of crosstalk between imaging researchers.
Okay, then, well, while I've got them up, standing up in front of you, I'd just like to thank all our speakers for taking their time out and sharing some of their research with you this morning. I think they deserve a round of applause.